My husband had an affair with my little sister. I thought I knew why, until she told me the truth. Throwaway account. This is long, and I've rewritten the opening of it more times than I can count trying to figure out where a story like this actually begins. I don't think there's a clean answer. I'm just going to start where it started hurting the most and work backward from there, because that's the only order any of this ever made sense to me in. The worst part wasn't finding my husband in bed with my little sister. It was the fact that my sister was crying harder than I was. I remember standing in that doorway, one hand still on the frame like it was the only thing keeping me upright, staring at the two people I trusted most in the entire world, and thinking there had to be some explanation. Some horrible misunderstanding. Some mistake my brain would eventually sort itself out of, the way you sometimes misread a text message and feel the whole world tilt for 4 seconds before the words rearrange themselves into something ordinary. Then my husband looked at me, and his face didn't have the panic I expected. It had something closer to exhaustion, like he'd been waiting a long time for this specific moment to finally arrive. He said, "Elise, please, you don't understand what happened." And my sister, still crying, still not able to look at me directly, whispered, "He's lying." That was the exact moment I understood this wasn't the affair I thought it was. I just had no idea yet how much bigger it actually was, or how long it had been quietly building underneath a marriage I would have sworn, right up until that night, was the one solid thing in my entire life. I need to go backward before I can explain any of what came after, because I don't think you can understand how much that night cost me without first understanding what I thought I had. I'm 32, I work as an interior designer, mostly residential projects. The kind of work where you spend months inside other people's homes learning the small, specific ways they live before you ever touch a single wall. I met Nathaniel Calder, Nate, to everyone who knew him, at a mutual friend's birthday party almost 9 years ago, back when I was 23 and still deeply unsure of most things about my own life. He wasn't loud in the way a lot of men are at parties like that, working the room, performing confidence at everyone in earshot. He was sitting slightly apart from the main group, talking quietly with someone about a book I'd also read, and I remember thinking, before I even properly introduced myself, that he had the specific kind of calm that made a room feel less chaotic just by him being in it. We talked for almost 2 hours that night, and by the end of it I already knew, with a certainty I didn't entirely trust at 23 but that turned out to be right, that I wanted to know this person for a very long time. Our relationship developed the way good ones are supposed to, slowly enough that I never once felt swept off my feet in a way that should have made me suspicious later, though I've turned that over more than a few times since. He remembered small things about me that I'd only mentioned once, in passing, the specific way I take my coffee, a childhood nickname I hadn't used in years, the fact that I got anxious in elevators after getting briefly stuck in one during college. He supported my career from the very beginning, sitting through my early portfolio reviews with a patience most people wouldn't have had for someone else's professional anxiety. And when my first solo design business failed spectacularly 2 years into our relationship, losing nearly everything I'd put into it, he was the one who sat with me on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. while I cried about it, not offering solutions, just staying there until I was ready to stand up again. When my father died 4 years ago, a sudden heart attack that none of us saw coming, Nate took over almost everything logistical about the funeral without being asked, because he could see I didn't have the capacity to manage it myself, and he remembered, unprompted, the exact restaurant where we'd had our first actual date, because he brought me there quietly a week after the funeral, just the two of us, without making it into anything bigger than what it needed to be. Once, during a work trip to another city, I realized I'd left an important flash drive with an entire project on it sitting on my kitchen counter, and Nate, without complaint, drove 3 hours each way to bring it to me himself rather than mailing it, because he said he didn't trust the mail with something that mattered that much to me. I'm telling you all of this not to make you feel sorry for me later, but because I need you to understand that this wasn't an obviously bad marriage. Nobody who knew us would have predicted what happened. That's exactly what made it hurt as much as it did. My younger sister Ren is 6 years younger than me, 26 at the time all of this happened, working as a veterinary assistant at a clinic across town, a job she genuinely loved despite the mediocre pay. Ren and I have always been close in the specific, complicated way sisters are when there's enough of an age gap that you spend part of your childhood almost parenting them and the rest of it as genuine equals. She's impulsive in ways I've never been, affectionate in ways that sometimes embarrassed me at family gatherings when we were younger, And she carries an insecurity underneath all of it that I don't think she's ever fully worked through. Some quiet sense that she was always the less accomplished one, the less steady one, the one our mother worried about differently than she worried about me. About a year before everything happened, Ren went through a difficult breakup with a boyfriend she'd been living with for 2 years, one that ended badly enough that she needed to leave their shared apartment almost immediately, with nowhere stable lined up to go. I offered our guest room without a second thought, the way you do for someone you love without needing to weigh it. Nate agreed just as readily. Neither of us hesitated. The first few months of Ren living with us were, if anything, better than I expected. We had dinner together most nights, the 3 of us, something that made our house feel fuller in a way I hadn't realized I'd been missing. We watched terrible reality television together on weekends, the kind neither Nate nor I would have admitted to enjoying alone. Ren started helping around the house without being asked, and Nate, who has always had a natural talent for giving practical advice without making it feel condescending, spent time helping her think through her career options, whether she wanted to pursue veterinary school eventually or stay where she was. I remember thinking, more than once during those early months, that my family had somehow become closer because of a situation that started as a crisis, and feeling grateful for that in a way that now sits strangely in my chest whenever I think back on it. It was small things at first, nothing I could have pointed to directly if anyone had asked me to justify a feeling. I'd walk into the kitchen and find Ren and Nate mid-conversation, and the conversation would simply stop, replaced by a silence that felt deliberate rather than natural. I'd ask lightly, "What were you two talking about?" and get, almost every time, some version of nothing, delivered in a tone that made the word feel heavier than it should have. I noticed, too, that Nate seemed to know exactly what made Ren laugh, in a way that felt oddly specific for someone who'd known her for less than a year. Timing and cadence that usually only develops between people who have spent a lot of unsupervised time together. I told myself I was being paranoid, that of course 2 people living in the same house would develop their own private jokes eventually, that this was simply what it looked like when a family expanded to include someone new. Around the same period, Nate started texting more frequently, late at night, phone angled slightly away from me on the nightstand, in a way I hadn't consciously registered as strange until I found myself registering it anyway. When I asked who it was, the answer was always the same. Work. I believed him mostly because I'd never had a reason not to. There was one night, a little over 2 months into Ren living with us, when I woke up around 2 in the morning and reached across the bed out of habit and found it empty. I lay there for a minute, telling myself he'd probably just gone downstairs for water, before curiosity got the better of me and I went to check. I found Ren sitting alone at the kitchen table in the dark, not doing anything, just sitting there, and something about her posture, the way her shoulders were curled inward, made my stomach tighten before it even said anything. "Why are you awake?" I asked. "Couldn't sleep," she said, not quite meeting my eyes. A moment later, Nate walked in from the hallway, saying he'd come down for water, holding an empty glass as evidence, and on the surface nothing about the scene was technically wrong, nothing that would hold up if you tried to explain it to someone else afterward. But Ren left the room almost immediately, faster than the situation seemed to call for, and I stood there in my own kitchen at 2 in the morning with a feeling I couldn't name yet. Something between suspicion and a reflexive shame at even having the suspicion at all. Over the following weeks, the dynamic in the house shifted in a way that's hard to fully describe except to say that it felt like weather changing. Nate became quieter, more distant in small ways, less talkative at dinner, more absorbed in his phone, slower to reach for me the way he used to without thinking about it. Ren, meanwhile, became almost aggressively affectionate toward me, in a way that in hindsight I understand completely, but that at the time simply confused me. She started making my coffee in the mornings before I was even fully awake, leaving small handwritten notes on the bathroom mirror, hugging me unprompted in the middle of ordinary afternoons, asking me, more than once, in a careful, searching way, whether I was happy in my marriage. I told my best friend Mara about it over drinks one night, mostly venting about how strange the whole atmosphere in my house had become without being able to point to any single thing as evidence of anything. Mara has known me since college, and she has never once been afraid to tell me something I didn't want to hear. She listened to the whole thing, quiet for longer than usual, and then said, "Elise, I'm not saying anything is definitely happening, but something isn't right in that house, and I think you already know that, or you wouldn't be telling me all of this in this much detail." I told her she was probably overreacting. Some part of me, even as I said it, didn't believe myself. The first real evidence came almost by accident. I was charging my phone one evening using Nate's charger because mine had gone missing somewhere in the house, and when I picked up his phone to move it out of the way, a message notification lit up the screen before I could stop myself from reading it. No name attached, just a number I didn't recognize, and 4 words that have stayed lodged in my memory with a clarity nothing else from that period has matched. She almost saw us. Nate took the phone from my hand almost the instant I looked up at him, his voice immediately smooth, already explaining something about a difficult client situation at work, someone he was trying to keep a colleague from finding out about prematurely. I remember nodding, saying I understood, going back to whatever I'd been doing before, and I remember just as clearly not believing a single word of it even as I said the words that suggested I did. I didn't confront him that night. Instead, I did something I'm not particularly proud of, but that I think, looking back, was the only version of myself capable of getting to the truth, without simply being talked back out of my own instincts the way I had been so many times before with people I loved. I started quietly investigating on my own. It took me almost 3 weeks, working carefully, checking things when I had the house to myself, cross-referencing dates and receipts and the small gaps in Nate's schedule that I'd never had reason to notice before. What I eventually found left very little room for the kind of misunderstanding I'd been hoping for. Deleted text threads I managed to partially recover through an old backup. A hotel receipt tucked into the inside pocket of a jacket he rarely wore, dated to an afternoon he told me he was at a client meeting. A handful of photographs, buried in a cloud folder under a name that meant nothing to me until I actually opened it, photographs that made the entire shape of the previous few months rearrange itself in my head with sickening speed. And then, finally, unmistakably, the identity of the other person in nearly all of it. My sister. I confronted them together, though confronted barely covers what actually happened, because by the time I walked into that room with everything already laid out in my head, some part of me had gone strangely calm, the way I imagine people describe the eye of a storm. I didn't scream. I remember that specifically because I'd always assumed if I ever found myself in a moment like that, I would scream, and instead my voice came out flat and quiet in a way that scared me more than yelling would have. I asked Nate how long. He didn't answer immediately. I asked again, my voice not rising at all, just repeating the exact same 2 words. How long? Finally, quietly, looking somewhere just past my shoulder instead of at my face, he said, 4 months. 4 months. Roughly the same span of time Ren had been living under our roof, sleeping 20 feet from where I slept every night, making me coffee in the mornings, leaving notes on the mirror. I turned to her next, and the question that came out of me wasn't the one I expected to ask first. Not why or how could you, but something smaller and somehow worse. Did you ever love me? Ren broke down completely at that question in a way she hadn't at any point before it, and something about the specific shape of her collapse told me, even through my own devastation, that the question had landed somewhere I hadn't fully anticipated. There was another evening, maybe 3 weeks after the 2 a.m. kitchen scene, that I've turned over more than almost any other moment from that period, mostly because at the time it seemed almost sweet, and it took me months afterward to recognize it for what it actually was. I came home early from a client meeting that had ended sooner than expected, and I found Ren sitting on the edge of our bed, of all places, going through a box of old photographs I kept in the closet, the kind of thing I wouldn't have thought twice about under any other circumstance. She startled hard enough when she saw me that she nearly dropped the box entirely, and when I asked lightly what she was looking for, she said she'd just been curious about what I looked like as a kid, that she liked seeing pictures of us together from before she could really remember. I believed her completely at the time, touched even, and it wasn't until much later that I understood she'd actually been looking for something specific. Some old photograph of our father's business dealings that she thought might still be tucked in with the family pictures. Evidence for a suspicion she hadn't yet told me anything about. I also remember, around that same stretch of weeks, Ren asking me, apropos of nothing during an otherwise ordinary dinner, whether Nate had ever mentioned his father to me in much detail. I told her not really, that Nate rarely talked about his parents at all, and she'd nodded slowly, filing something away behind her eyes that I didn't think to question at the time. I mentioned all of this to Mara during one of our regular Thursday dinners, more as scattered observations than anything I thought added up to a pattern, and I remember her going quiet in the specific way she does when she's actually paying close attention rather than just listening politely. "Elise," she said eventually, setting down her fork, "I need you to actually hear me on this. You've told me 4 separate things tonight that would each be nothing on their own, but you're describing an entire pattern, and I think some part of you already knows that, or you wouldn't remember all of it in this much detail. I told her I didn't know what she wanted me to do about it, that confronting Nate over a feeling with no actual evidence felt like it would blow up my marriage over nothing if I was wrong. She didn't push me to confront him that night. What she did do, a few weeks later, once I'd finally found the hotel receipt and the photographs and everything else, was talk me out of driving straight to the house and throwing every one of Wren's belongings onto the front lawn the moment I found out, which had been my first, genuine instinct in the raw hour after I'd pieced it all together. "You'll want to have done this calmly," she told me, sitting across from me on her own couch while I shook with an anger I didn't fully trust myself to act on safely. "Not because they deserve calm, because you deserve to remember handling this like yourself instead of like someone you don't recognize afterward." I didn't fully appreciate that advice in the moment. I've appreciated it considerably more since. I expected, in the days that followed, for Wren to simply be the villain of this story. The person I'd need to grieve as a sister I no longer recognized. What I got instead was considerably more complicated, and it started with a sentence I initially assumed was just another manipulation, another attempt to soften what she'd done. "I never wanted him," she said, sitting across from me at Mara's kitchen table 2 days later, because Mara had insisted, gently but firmly, that Wren and I needed to have this conversation somewhere neutral, somewhere I wouldn't be tempted to simply walk out mid-sentence the way I had every previous attempt at conversation. I told her I didn't believe that 4 months of secret meetings didn't happen to someone who never wanted the other person involved. She held my gaze longer than she had in weeks and said, "I was trying to find out what he was hiding." I sat with that sentence for a long moment before I could even formulate a response. Why would someone have an affair to investigate something? It didn't make sense on its face, and some cynical, hurt part of me assumed it was simply the most convenient excuse available to her. But something in the specific way she said it, tired rather than desperate, made me stay in that chair instead of leaving. What Wren told me next took most of an hour to fully unpack, and by the end of it, I understood that the affair, as devastating as it was on its own, had never been the actual center of what had been happening in my house for the better part of a year. She told me that months before anything physical had happened between her and Nate, she'd started noticing things about him that unsettled her, specific questions he'd ask, casually, during ordinary conversations, that seemed designed to extract information rather than simply make conversation. Questions about our father's death, more detailed than grief alone would explain. Questions about our mother's finances, framed innocently enough that I might not have noticed them myself if Wren hadn't been paying closer attention. Questions about my childhood that went beyond normal interest in a partner's history. Questions, eventually, about an old family property, upstate that our parents had owned briefly when Wren and I were very young, one neither of us had thought about in years. Wren said she'd initially assumed Nate was simply curious, the way people sometimes are about their partner's family, but the pattern kept accumulating in a way that eventually felt less like curiosity and more like research. She started to believe, without any solid proof at first, that Nate was planning something, though she genuinely didn't know what. So she began investigating him quietly on her own, the same way I would eventually investigate the affair itself, checking things when she had the opportunity, asking careful questions of her own, trying to understand what exactly he was looking for. Somewhere in the middle of that investigation, she admitted, her feelings had gotten dangerously tangled up with the access she was gaining, and she'd made a choice she still couldn't fully explain to herself, let alone to me. What Wren eventually uncovered, in the months before I ever noticed anything myself, was something about our mother that neither of us had known. Years earlier, not long after our father's death, Celeste had quietly withdrawn a significant sum from an inheritance account that was supposed to be split evenly between Wren and me eventually, an account tied to that same old family property upstate. Wren had found the paperwork almost by accident, going through boxes in our mother's garage during a visit, and what struck her as strange wasn't simply that the money had been withdrawn, but where it had gone afterward. Into an account that, after considerable digging, appeared to be controlled by someone connected to Nate's family. Not Nate directly, as far as Wren could tell at the time, but close enough that the coincidence stopped feeling like a coincidence at all. I sat in Mara's kitchen absorbing this, feeling something shift underneath the entire foundation of what I thought my marriage had been. Nate hadn't randomly entered my life at a friend's birthday party 9 years ago. Somewhere underneath that ordinary, unremarkable meeting, there had apparently been a connection to my family that predated it, one he had never once mentioned in 9 years together. I spent the following 2 weeks doing something I never expected to find myself doing, investigating my own husband's history the way you'd research a stranger. And Mara, true to the role she'd always played in my life, stayed close through most of it, more than once talking me down from decisions I was too raw to make clearly on my own. I started with public records, court filings from decades earlier that were tedious enough to search through that I nearly gave up twice, before finally finding a case number that matched a name I recognized. I hired a lawyer Mara found for me, a careful, unhurried man named Desmond Faraday who specialized in exactly this kind of old, tangled financial dispute, and I remember sitting in his office the first time, laying out everything I'd found so far, and having him tell me gently that cases like this usually went a lot deeper than the first layer anyone finds. Families don't usually fight like this over nothing, he said. By the time it's calcified into silence this complete, there's almost always more than one person's version of the truth buried in it. I also reached out carefully to a cousin on Nate's side I'd only met twice at holiday gatherings over the years, a woman named Priscilla who turned out to be considerably more willing to talk than I expected once I explained, honestly, what I was trying to understand. She told me things about Nate's father that Nate himself had apparently never shared with me in 9 years together. That he'd been a difficult, controlling man for most of his life, prone to grudges he nursed for decades, the kind of person who brought up old business slights at family dinners as though they'd happened the week before instead of 30 years earlier. What I eventually found, piecing it together from all of these fragments, old public records and a few careful conversations with distant relatives on Nate's side I'd met only a handful of times over the years, was that Nate's father had once been involved in a legal dispute with my own father, decades earlier, back when both men were still young and building the businesses that would eventually define the rest of their lives. The dispute, whatever it had actually been about, was never fully resolved in any court, and the two families had simply lost contact afterward, an entire chapter of both our histories that neither Ren nor I had ever been told about growing up. Which meant, as far as I could determine, that Nate had known exactly who I was, or at least known the family name, well before that party 9 years ago. That single realization did something to me that the affair itself, as painful as it was, somehow hadn't managed to do quite as completely. It made me question whether the entire relationship, the 9 years, the marriage, the version of my life I'd built around trusting this specific person, had started with a lie sitting underneath it the whole time. I confronted Nate about it directly, the two of us alone in the house for the first time since everything had come apart, sitting across from each other at the same kitchen table where I'd once found Ren sitting alone at 2 in the morning. I asked him the question that had been sitting in my chest for days, unable to fully form until that exact moment. Did you marry me because you loved me? He was quiet for long enough that I almost got up and left before he answered. At first no, he said, and something in me went very still and very cold hearing it out loud, confirmed, no longer just a suspicion I could talk myself out of in weaker moments. Then he continued, his voice lower, more careful than I'd heard it in months. But eventually, yes. He told me haltingly that his father had carried a grudge against my father for decades over whatever had happened in that old dispute. A grudge Nate had grown up hearing about in fragments his whole childhood, enough that when he'd realized, at that birthday party 9 years ago, exactly whose daughter I was, some part of him had leaned into the introduction with intentions that had nothing to do with genuine interest. But he insisted, and something in the specific exhaustion of how he said it made me believe at least this part of it, that whatever had started as calculation had turned, gradually over months and then years, into something real. That the man who'd sat with me on that bathroom floor after my business failed, who'd driven 3 hours to bring me a flash drive, who'd remembered our first restaurant, hadn't been performing any of it. I didn't know, sitting there. Whether that made things better or unbearably worse. Both feelings sat in my chest at the same time, refusing to resolve into anything simpler. Ren's fuller confession came a few days later, and it was, if anything, harder to hear than anything before it, because it stripped away the last version of the story, where she got to remain simply a victim of circumstance. She told me she hadn't stumbled onto Nate's secret by accident at all. She'd deliberately gotten close to him, spent months cultivating a version of trust with him, specifically, so she could dig deeper into what she'd started to genuinely believe, based on everything she'd found, was some kind of plan to financially destroy me, to slowly extract whatever debt he believed our family owed his. She said she'd told herself for a long time that this was protection, that she was doing something difficult and uncomfortable specifically to shield me from something she didn't yet fully understand. But somewhere in the process of spending that much unsupervised time with him, something had shifted that she still couldn't fully explain even to herself, and she had crossed a line she knew, even as she was crossing it, she'd never be able to fully justify afterward, no matter how good her original intentions had been. She hated herself for it, she told me, more than she thought I could possibly hate her for it myself, and looking at her face when she said that, I believed at least that part completely, even while the rest of me was still raw enough that belief didn't yet translate into anything resembling forgiveness. The final layer of it, the part that recontextualized almost everything that had come before, arrived almost a month after that first terrible night, once I'd pieced together enough from old records, from a lawyer Mara helped me find who specialized in exactly this kind of decades-old financial dispute, from careful, difficult conversations with relatives on both sides who'd been carrying pieces of this story, their entire lives, without ever putting them together the way I was now being forced to. Ren hadn't been entirely right about what Nate had actually been trying to uncover. He hadn't been building toward destroying me financially at all, not in the end. What he'd actually been chasing, quietly, methodically, for longer than either Ren or I had initially realized, was proof of something considerably more complicated. Evidence that suggested my own father, decades earlier, had been the one who'd taken money from a joint venture between the two families. Money that Nate's father had spent the rest of his life believing had simply vanished into bad luck rather than deliberate theft. Ren and I sat with that revelation together in her small new apartment across town, both of us absorbing the fact that our entire childhood understanding of our own family, the quiet, unspoken tension our mother had always deflected around whenever certain topics came up, had been built on a version of events that wasn't the whole truth either. There's a particular kind of grief that comes from realizing your own memories need to be reread entirely, and I spent the quietest stretch of that whole period doing exactly that, sitting alone one evening with an old shoebox of family photographs I hadn't opened in years. I found myself looking at pictures from childhood birthdays, family vacations, ordinary Sunday dinners, and seeing, for the first time, all the small moments I'd never thought to question before. The way my mother would change the subject abruptly whenever anyone mentioned the old upstate property. The way my father, gentle as he generally was, would go rigid and quiet if a conversation ever drifted anywhere near his old business dealings. The specific, subtle way Ren had always seemed to be treated slightly differently than I was growing up, praised differently, worried over differently, in a pattern I'd noticed as a child without ever having language for it, and had mostly forgotten as an adult. There was one photograph in particular, taken at what must have been my 8th birthday party, that stopped me for a long time, my father standing slightly apart from the rest of the group, looking at something just outside the frame, an expression on his face that I'd always read as simple tiredness whenever I'd glanced past that photograph before, and that I now recognized, looking at it with everything I understood by that point, as something closer to a man carrying a weight he never once let any of us see directly. I called Ren that night, later than I probably should have, just to describe the photograph to her, and she was quiet on the other end of the line for a long moment before saying softly, "I think I have a version of that same feeling about almost every picture of him now." I understood, sitting there with those photographs spread across my kitchen table, that my parents had been managing something between them for our entire childhoods, something neither Ren nor I had ever been allowed to see clearly, and that whatever it was had apparently been significant enough to eventually reach forward, decades later, and quietly detonate my marriage. I brought Nate, Ren, and my mother together in the same room for the first time since everything had come apart, sitting them down at my kitchen table with the documentation I'd assembled laid out in front of all of us, and told my mother, as calmly as I could manage, that I needed the entire truth, not the version she'd been managing for 30 years. Celeste sat very still for a long time before she finally started talking, and once she started, it came out of her in a way that suggested she'd been carrying it, unspoken, for far longer than any of us had realized. Years ago, she said, my father and Nate's father had been business partners, close ones, before either of them had married or started their own families. A significant amount of money had disappeared from an account the two men had shared, and both sides had ended up blaming the other with no clean resolution ever reached, no court case that settled it definitively one way or the other. "Your father came home one night," she said, her voice thinner than I'd ever heard it, "and told me he'd been accused of something he hadn't done, by a man he'd trusted more than almost anyone outside our own family. He spent years trying to prove it wasn't him. I watched it eat at him a little more every single year, until eventually he just stopped talking about it at all, because talking about it had stopped changing anything. I asked her directly why she'd never told either of us any of this growing up, why an entire chapter of our own father's life had simply been erased from what we were allowed to know about him. She looked down at her hands for a long moment before answering. "Because I didn't want either of you carrying a grudge you didn't create," she said. "I thought if I just let it stay buried, it would eventually stop mattering to anyone but me and your father. I was wrong about that. I understand now that I was wrong." Celeste had known, she admitted, more than she'd ever let either of us understand growing up. She'd hidden it, she said, because she believed, at the time and for years afterward, that she was protecting us from a conflict that had nothing to do with our own lives. A decision she now understood, sitting at that table with all three of us watching her, had actually just delayed the exact reckoning she'd been trying to prevent. But there was one final piece still missing, the one that finally settled the entire shape of the story once and for all. Nate, quietly, carefully, told the rest of what he'd learned only after marrying me, long after the wedding, long after any version of why he'd originally approached me could still be excused as simple ignorance. He'd discovered, through documents his own father had never intended him to see, that the original theft, the one both families had spent decades blaming on each other, had actually been his father's doing. His father had taken the money himself and had deliberately, methodically framed my father for it, allowing the blame to sit on the wrong man for the rest of both their lives. Nate said that discovering this well into our marriage had upended everything he'd believed about his own family growing up, and that what had started as a search for evidence against my father, a search that had originally motivated the calculated, ugly beginning of our relationship, had turned, once he found the truth, into something else entirely. He hadn't been trying to build a case against me at all, not by the time any of the affair had started. He'd been trying, quietly, to figure out how to prove his own father's guilt without destroying the family he'd genuinely come to love in the process. It didn't excuse what he'd done with Ren. He said so himself, plainly, without trying to soften it. Neither did it excuse Ren's own choices, whatever her original intentions had been. But it meant, at least, that the man I'd married hadn't been quite the calculated stranger I'd spent the last month afraid he actually was. I left both of them anyway. Not in a single dramatic moment, but gradually, over the following weeks, in a series of smaller decisions that added up to the same conclusion. Not because I'd stopped understanding their reasons, and not out of some need for revenge that I never actually felt as strongly as I expected to. I left because I understood, somewhere in the middle of untangling all of it, that I couldn't build the rest of my life around two people who had each, in their own separate ways, decided that I didn't deserve the whole truth until circumstances forced their hand. Ren moved 2 states away a few months later, taking a new job at a larger veterinary practice, and we haven't spoken much since, though she still texts occasionally, careful, tentative messages I mostly don't answer, not out of cruelty, but because I genuinely don't know yet what I'd say back. Nate still emails me every so often, months apart now, and I've never once opened them. I don't know exactly what I'm protecting myself from by leaving them unread. Maybe just the version of hope that would come from finding out he's still thinking about all of it the way I sometimes still am. I visited my mother a few months ago, the first time since that final conversation at my kitchen table, and near the end of the visit, standing in her kitchen the way we always seem to end up standing in kitchens in this family, she asked me quietly, almost afraid of the answer, "Do you think you'll ever forgive us?" I thought about it longer than the question probably warranted, both of us just standing there in the silence while I worked out what I actually believed instead of what might simply be easiest to say. "Maybe," I told her finally. Then, because I needed her to understand the distinction clearly, but forgiveness doesn't mean I have to come back. It's been 11 months now since I found them together in that room. Ren hasn't spoken to me in 6 of those months, not because either of us decided to formally cut things off, just because the gaps between her tentative messages kept growing until they stopped altogether, and neither of us has reached across it yet. Nate still sends the occasional email. I still don't open them. The strangest thing, if I'm honest, is that I don't hate either of them anymore, not the way I expected to feel 11 months out from that night. I used to think forgiveness meant pretending something never happened, smoothing it over until it stopped being visible. I think now it's closer to the opposite of that. You remember exactly what someone did in specific, unflinching detail, and you simply stop letting that memory decide what happens next in your own life. My sister betrayed me. My husband betrayed me in more ways and for longer than I originally understood. My parents lied to both of us for most of our childhoods, for reasons that made a certain kind of sense and still weren't good enough reasons. And somehow, 11 months later, I'm still here, building something that's entirely mine for the first time in longer than I can remember. That's enough for me right now. Some days, it's even more than enough. Edit, to everyone asking whether I've considered reaching back out to Ren, I think about it more than I let on here. I'm just not ready yet, and I've stopped pretending I have to be ready on anyone's timeline but my own.